The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my apartment door like an afterthought. Chen Digital Marketing Solutions annual reunion celebrating our growth and success. It proclaimed in bold letters, complete with a photo of the new downtown office building I'd helped secure funding for but never got to see completed. At the bottom, in smaller print, we hope to see all former team members who contributed to our journey. Former team members. That's what I was now, not the senior account manager who'd landed their 3 biggest clients. Not the operations director who'd streamlined their entire workflow system. Hey everyone, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just a former team member whose contributions had apparently been forgotten along with my nameplate. My name is Jessica Martinez, and 18 months ago I thought I was building something meaningful at Chen Digital Marketing Solutions in Riverside, California. I thought loyalty, results, and genuine care for the business would eventually translate into recognition, partnership, maybe even a stake in the company I'd helped grow from a small family operation into the city's premier digital marketing firm. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was right about one thing: I did help build something meaningful. I just didn't realize I was building it for myself, not for them. I didn't throw the invitation away, though part of me wanted to. Instead, I propped it against my coffee maker and stared at it while I planned my day. 18 months had passed since Robert Chen, the company founder, had called me into his office for what I thought would be a performance review. Instead, it was a termination meeting disguised as a restructuring conversation. His son Michael, fresh out of USC with an MBA and 0 real-world experience, needed more responsibility, Robert explained. The company was evolving, and they needed to optimize their leadership structure. What they needed, apparently, was to remove the person who'd been handling the actual operations while Michael learned the ropes by taking credit for my strategies. I remembered that day with crystalline clarity, because it was the moment I stopped believing in the myth of meritocracy. Robert had sat behind his mahogany desk, the one I'd helped him pick out when we moved to the larger office space, and delivered the news with the detached efficiency of someone discussing quarterly projections. "We're going in a different direction, Jessica. Your last day will be Friday." No acknowledgement of the 60-hour weeks I'd pulled during the Henderson Industries campaign. No mention of the client retention rate I'd improved by 43%. No recognition that I'd been the one to negotiate the terms of the very loan that had paid for his mahogany desk. But I hadn't argued. I hadn't demanded explanations or threatened legal action. I'd simply nodded, cleaned out my desk, and spent that weekend doing something I'd never done before in my professional life. I planned my exit so thoroughly that even I was surprised by my own methodical approach. Some people have explosive reactions to betrayal. Others have strategic ones. I discovered I was the strategic type. The Chen family had built their business on a simple promise: they treated employees like family and rewarded loyalty with opportunity. Robert Chen had started the company 12 years earlier, after losing his job at a larger firm during the economic downturn. He'd bootstrapped the operation from his garage, slowly building a client base through referrals and genuine relationships. When I joined 3 years earlier, Chen Digital was still small enough that everyone wore multiple hats, but growing fast enough that those hats were becoming increasingly specialized. I'd come to them from a corporate marketing position that had left me feeling like a cog in an impersonal machine. Robert's pitch during my interview had been compelling. Join a growing company where your contributions matter, where success is shared, where hard work leads to advancement. Linda Chen, Robert's wife and the company's administrative manager, had nodded along enthusiastically. "We don't just hire employees," she'd said. "We bring people into our family." It sounded exactly like what I'd been looking for after years of feeling invisible in corporate hierarchies. For the first 2 years, it felt genuine. I threw myself into client relationships, developed new processes for campaign management, and even created the employee handbook that Linda had been meaning to write for months. I worked early mornings and late evenings, not because I was forced to, but because I genuinely believed I was building something that would eventually include me as more than just a highly productive employee. When Michael graduated from USC and joined the company, I welcomed the chance to mentor someone with fresh perspectives and family insights. Michael Chen was charming in the way that comes naturally to people who've never had to question their place in the world. He had his father's easy confidence and his mother's ability to make people feel heard, even when he wasn't actually listening. During his first month, he shadowed me on client calls, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. I appreciated his curiosity and his willingness to start from the ground up, despite being the owner's son. Looking back, I realize I was watching a masterclass in strategic positioning, not genuine learning. The shift happened gradually, so subtly that I almost missed it. Client emails that used to come directly to me started being copied to Michael. Strategy meetings that I'd previously run began including his fresh perspectives as co-facilitator. Project timelines I'd developed were suddenly presented as collaborative efforts, with Michael's insights given equal weight to my 3 years of client-specific knowledge. When I mentioned this pattern to Linda during one of our weekly check-ins, she assured me it was temporary. Robert wants Michael to understand every aspect of the business, she explained. You're the perfect person to teach him. Consider it a compliment. I considered it a compliment for exactly 4 weeks, until I discovered that the Henderson Industries campaign strategy I'd spent 6 months developing was being presented to the client with Michael as the primary strategist and me listed as supporting team member. The campaign that had become our largest contract, the one that had allowed the company to lease the downtown office space and hire 3 new employees, was now Michael's vision brought to life with my assistance. When I raised this with Robert, his response was immediate and cutting. We're a team here, Jessica. Success belongs to everyone. I hope you're not becoming territorial about ideas that benefit the whole company. Territorial. That word followed me home that night and settled into my thinking like a splinter.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I wasn't being territorial about ideas. I was being protective of my professional identity, my contributions, and my future. But in Robert's framework, those were the same thing, and both were problematic. I realized then that I'd misunderstood the family dynamic completely. In this family, there were parents, children, and employees. I'd somehow convinced myself I was becoming a child when I'd always been, and would always be, just an employee. That's when I started documenting everything. Not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. I created a private cloud folder and began uploading every email where I'd originated strategy, every client testimonial that mentioned my name specifically, every project timeline that showed my role as lead coordinator. I wasn't building a legal case. I was building a reality check, a way to confirm that my contributions were as significant as I believed them to be. The folder grew quickly. 3 years of work condensed into undeniable evidence of my value to the company. The documentation project revealed patterns I'd been too busy to notice while living them. Client acquisition always peaked during months when I was leading outreach efforts. Campaign performance ratings consistently improved on projects where I maintained primary contact throughout implementation. Revenue growth directly correlated with initiatives I'd proposed and executed. The numbers told a story that the office dynamics had obscured. I wasn't just a valuable employee. I was the operational backbone of everything Chen Digital had achieved during my tenure. 6 months before my termination, the company had secured a significant expansion loan to move into the downtown Riverside office space that would accommodate their growing team. The bank had required multiple guarantors, and Robert had asked me to co-sign based on my excellent credit and stable employment history. You're essential to our growth plans, Jessica, he'd explained. The bank wants to see that our key people are invested in the company's future. I'd signed the paperwork without hesitation, proud to be considered essential, grateful to be trusted with such responsibility. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me 18 months later as I held the reunion invitation. The downtown office they were celebrating had been partially funded through my financial commitment, but I'd never worked a single day in the space I'd helped them acquire. I'd been terminated 3 months before the move, with Robert citing the need to streamline operations and optimize our team structure for the new environment. My final paycheck had been generous, he'd noted, as if severance pay somehow balanced the equation of being discarded after providing the financial backing for their expansion. That's when I called Amanda Torres, a friend from college who'd built a successful consulting practice helping people navigate professional transitions. We met at Brew and Bean, a coffee shop near UC Riverside, where we'd spent countless hours during our graduate program. I explained the situation carefully, focusing on facts rather than feelings. Amanda listened with the kind of attention that made me remember why I'd always trusted her judgment. You co-signed their expansion loan, she asked, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. And they terminated you 3 months later. I nodded, watching her process the timeline. Jessica, that's not just unprofessional, it's strategically stupid. You could withdraw your guarantee and create serious problems for their financing. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but as Amanda explained the legal mechanics, I realized I had more leverage than I'd understood. More importantly, I had options beyond simply accepting their version of my dismissal. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop, mapping out possibilities and potential consequences. Amanda was thorough in her questions and careful in her advice. She didn't encourage revenge or dramatic confrontation. Instead, she helped me understand my rights, my risks, and my opportunities. By the time we parted ways, I had a clear action plan, and for the first time since the termination meeting, a sense of agency in my own professional story. I didn't withdraw from the loan immediately. Instead, I spent 2 weeks researching the legal requirements, consulting with a financial advisor, and documenting my contributions to the company's loan application. The process was revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated. My employment history, client relationships, and operational knowledge had been significant factors in the bank's approval decision. The loan officer had specifically mentioned my role as a stability indicator during the approval process. Without my guarantee, the loan terms would have been substantially different, if available at all. 3 weeks after my termination, I submitted formal notice to withdraw my guarantee from the Chen Digital expansion loan. The letter was professionally written, legally sound, and completely within my rights as someone who was no longer employed by the company. I sent copies to the bank, to Robert Chen, and to my attorney for record keeping. Then I waited to see how a family business would handle losing the financial backing of someone they'd decided was no longer family. The response was immediate and panicked. Robert called my personal phone 6 times in 2 hours, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. Linda sent text messages, asking if we could work something out. Michael, who'd rarely communicated with me directly during his time at the company, suddenly wanted to schedule coffee to discuss mutual solutions. The bank froze the loan pending review of the changed guarantor status, effectively halting the company's expansion plans and creating cash flow problems that rippled through their entire operation. I didn't return the calls immediately. Instead, I took a weekend to drive down to San Diego, a city I'd always loved but never considered living in. I spent 2 days walking through different neighborhoods, imagining what it might feel like to start over somewhere that had no connection to my previous professional life. The possibility felt both terrifying and exhilarating. By Sunday evening, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to try to salvage my relationship with Chen Digital. I was going to build something entirely new. Monday morning brought a call from Patricia Walsh, the company's accountant, and someone I'd always respected for her straightforward approach to business problems. "Jessica, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "The bank situation is creating serious complications for the company's liquidity. Robert is asking if you'd consider reinstating your guarantee in exchange for a consulting contract and equity stake." The offer was significant, more than I'd ever expected when I was a full-time employee. It was also irrelevant. "Patricia," I replied, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in patching problems for a company that decided I wasn't essential to their future. They made their choice, now I'm making mine." She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. "I'm planning to succeed," I told her. Independently and definitively. The next 6 months were the most challenging and rewarding of my professional life. I moved to San Diego, established Martinez Consulting Group, and began reaching out to the network of small business owners I'd built relationships with during my time at Chen Digital. My approach was simple: offer the same quality of digital marketing strategy and implementation that larger firms provided, but with the personal attention and competitive pricing that small businesses needed to compete effectively. The business grew organically through referrals and results. Within 3 months, I had 6 regular clients. Within 6 months, I was turning down projects because I couldn't handle the volume alone. The success wasn't just financial, though the revenue quickly exceeded my previous salary. It was the satisfaction of building something that reflected my values and utilized my skills without the complications of family dynamics or corporate politics. What I hadn't anticipated was how my work would impact the broader Riverside business community. Many of my clients were downtown small businesses struggling to compete with larger retailers and online competition. As I helped them develop digital strategies, improve their online presence, and reach new customers, I began to see patterns in the challenges they faced. Downtown Riverside had incredible potential, but the small businesses needed coordinated support to realize that potential collectively. I proposed a collaborative approach where my clients would cross-promote each other, share resources, and present a unified brand for the downtown district. The concept required sophisticated digital coordination and strategic planning, exactly the kind of comprehensive project that I'd always wanted to lead but had never been given the authority to execute. Working with business owners who trusted my judgment and valued my contributions, I was able to implement strategies that created measurable improvements for individual businesses and the downtown area as a whole. The Downtown Riverside Revitalization Project, as it came to be known, attracted attention from the City Council, local media, and eventually the Mayor's office. What had started as individual consulting relationships had evolved into a community development initiative that was generating economic impact beyond what anyone had projected. Property values in the downtown district increased by 12%. Foot traffic improved by 38%. 6 new businesses opened in previously vacant storefronts. Mayor Jennifer Thompson invited me to present the project results at a city council meeting, praising the innovative approach to small business collaboration and the measurable positive impact on our community's economic development. The presentation was covered by the Riverside Press Enterprise and shared widely on social media. I was no longer just a consultant who'd left a local marketing firm. I was a community development success story, someone who'd created value that extended far beyond individual client relationships. That's the context that made the reunion invitation so interesting. Chen Digital Marketing Solutions was celebrating their growth and success, but I knew from my ongoing relationships in the Riverside business community that their growth had stalled significantly after the loan complications. They'd eventually secured alternative financing, but the delays had cost them several major clients and forced them to scale back their expansion plans. Meanwhile, my work with downtown businesses had generated the kind of community recognition that no amount of corporate marketing could purchase. I RSVP'd to the reunion with a simple looking forward to seeing everyone, and marked my calendar. It had been 18 months since I'd seen Robert, Linda, or Michael Chen. I was curious about what they'd built in the downtown office space I'd helped them secure, and I was confident about what I'd built for myself in the same time frame. The comparison would be illuminating for everyone involved. The reunion was held at the Riverside Community Center, a venue large enough to accommodate Chen Digital's current staff, former employees, and their families. I arrived fashionably late, not out of dramatic calculation, but because I'd driven up from San Diego after a morning client meeting. The parking lot was full, suggesting good attendance, and I could hear conversation and laughter from inside the building as I walked toward the entrance. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, professional but not corporate, successful but not ostentatious. A tailored navy blazer, dark jeans, and comfortable flats that suggested someone who was busy, but not trying too hard to impress anyone. My hair was shorter than it had been during my Chen Digital days, a change I'd made after moving to San Diego, as a visible reminder to myself that I was creating a new professional identity. The moment I walked through the door, conversations seemed to pause in the way that happens when someone unexpected arrives at a familiar gathering. I recognized most of the faces, colleagues I'd worked alongside for 3 years, plus newer employees I'd never met. Robert Chen was holding court near the refreshment table, gesturing animatedly, while describing something to a small group of listeners. Linda was organizing a display of company achievement photos near the entrance. Michael was nowhere immediately visible, though I assumed he was somewhere in the crowd. What struck me first was how differently people responded to seeing me. Some colleagues approached with genuine warmth, asking about my new business and expressing interest in staying connected. Others offered polite but distant greetings, as if my departure had been slightly scandalous and they weren't sure how to navigate the social dynamics. A few people seemed to avoid eye contact altogether, perhaps uncomfortable with the circumstances of my leaving, or uncertain about what had happened in the months since. The whispered conversations were harder to ignore. I caught fragments as I moved through the room, heard her consulting thing isn't going well, and probably regrets leaving when she did, and most tellingly, Robert said the loan situation was really complicated, but they worked it out. The narrative had clearly been shaped to minimize my role in both the company's previous success and their subsequent challenges. I was now a cautionary tale about the risks of leaving a stable situation for uncertain entrepreneurial ventures. I was considering how to navigate the evening when Mayor Jennifer Thompson arrived, accompanied by 2 city council members and a photographer from the press enterprise. Their presence immediately shifted the energy in the room, with Robert Chen moving quickly to greet them, and Linda arranging chairs for what appeared to be an impromptu presentation or photo opportunity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Thompson announced, her voice carrying easily across the room, "I'm delighted to be here celebrating the success of local businesses like Chen Digital Marketing Solutions. Companies like this one contribute to the economic vitality that makes Riverside such a thriving community." She paused, scanning the crowd, and her eyes stopped when she saw me near the back of the room. "And I'm especially pleased to see Jessica Martinez here tonight," she continued, her smile becoming more personal. "Jessica, would you join me up front? I'd love for everyone to hear about the incredible work you've been doing with our downtown business district." The room went completely silent. I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me, and I could see Robert Chen's expression shift from confident host to confused observer. I made my way to the front of the room, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that had stopped mid-sentence, and the family members who were now reassessing whatever they'd been told about my post-Chen Digital situation. Mayor Thompson gestured for me to stand beside her, and the photographer began taking pictures of what was clearly going to become a public relations moment. For those who don't know, Mayor Thompson addressed the room. "Jessica Martinez has been leading an innovative small business collaboration project in downtown Riverside that has generated remarkable economic development results. Property values are up, foot traffic has increased significantly, and we've seen new businesses opening in previously vacant spaces. The City Council has been so impressed with Jessica's work that we're considering expanding the model to other districts." She turned to me with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "Jessica, would you mind sharing some details about the project? I think everyone here would be interested in hearing about the kind of community impact that local expertise can create." The irony of the moment was not lost on me. I was being asked to present my success story to a room full of people who worked for the company that had decided I wasn't essential to their future. I accepted the impromptu speaking opportunity, with the same calm confidence I'd developed during client presentations. For 10 minutes I described the downtown Riverside revitalization project, explaining how strategic digital marketing coordination could create collective benefits that individual businesses couldn't achieve independently. I talked about the 38% increase in foot traffic, the 12% improvement in property values, and the 6 new businesses that had opened as a result of the increased economic activity. The audience was engaged and impressed, asking questions about implementation strategies and potential applications to other business districts. Several people mentioned that they'd noticed the improvements downtown, but hadn't realized there was a coordinated effort behind the changes. Robert Chen listened from the side of the room, his expression unreadable, but his body language suggesting someone who was rapidly recalculating a situation he thought he understood. When the presentation concluded, Mayor Thompson asked if she could have a photo with me for the city's social media accounts. "We love highlighting local success stories," she explained, "especially ones that demonstrate the kind of innovative thinking that benefits our entire community." The photographer took several shots of us together, and Mayor Thompson mentioned that the City Council would be discussing potential consulting opportunities for other districts at their next meeting. As the formal presentation wound down and conversations resumed, the dynamic in the room had shifted completely. People who had been distant or awkward in their greetings now approached with genuine interest in my work and obvious respect for the recognition I'd received. Several former colleagues mentioned that they'd driven through downtown recently and noticed the improvements, connecting them to my project for the first time. Michael Chen finally appeared at my side, looking like someone who was trying to process information that didn't match his expectations. "Jessica, I had no idea you were doing such significant work," he said, his tone more serious than I'd ever heard during our previous interactions. "I mean, we knew you'd started consulting, but this sounds like much more than typical client work." His acknowledgement felt genuine, though I could see him struggling to reconcile the success story he'd just witnessed with whatever narrative he'd constructed about my departure. Linda Chen approached with her characteristic warmth, but I could detect uncertainty beneath her familiar smile. "Jessica, dear, that was such an impressive presentation. We're so proud of what you've accomplished." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I hope you know that we always believed in your abilities. The situation with your leaving was just, well, it was complicated business circumstances." Her attempt to reframe my termination as mutual decision-making was transparent but not unkind. The most interesting interaction came when Robert Chen finally approached me near the end of the evening. He looked older than I remembered, perhaps worn down by the challenges of the past 18 months, but his demeanor was respectful in a way that it hadn't always been during my employment. "Jessica, I owe you an apology," he said, quietly, positioning himself so our conversation wouldn't be overheard by others nearby. "The way your departure was handled wasn't fair to someone who contributed as much as you did to the company's success. I've had 18 months to reflect on the decisions we made, and I realize we lost more than just an employee when you left. We lost institutional knowledge, client relationships, and operational expertise that took years to rebuild." His admission was more honest than I'd expected, and I found myself appreciating his willingness to acknowledge what had actually happened. "I appreciate you saying that, Robert," I replied. "The termination was difficult, but it led me to opportunities I wouldn't have pursued otherwise. Sometimes what feels like rejection becomes redirection towards something better suited to your goals and values." I meant it genuinely. The anger and disappointment I'd felt 18 months earlier had been replaced by gratitude for being forced to bet on myself, rather than waiting for others to recognize my worth. As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically the narrative had shifted from the beginning of the reunion to the end. I'd arrived as a former employee, whose departure had been explained as a business necessity, and whose subsequent success had been downplayed or dismissed. I was leaving as someone whose post-Chen Digital achievements had been publicly recognized by the mayor, and whose approach to community development was being considered for citywide expansion. The drive back to San Diego gave me time to process the evening and its implications. The reunion had provided closure in ways I hadn't anticipated. Seeing my former colleagues and the Chen family again had reminded me of the positive aspects of my time with the company, while also confirming that leaving had been the right decision for my professional growth and personal satisfaction. More significantly, the public recognition of my work had validated the strategic approach I'd taken to building my consulting practice. Rather than trying to compete directly with Chen Digital or other established marketing firms, I'd identified an underserved niche and developed expertise that created unique value for my clients and the broader community. The success wasn't just financial, though the business was thriving. It was the satisfaction of knowing that my work was generating positive impact that extended far beyond individual client relationships. The reunion invitation that had arrived 18 months after my termination had promised a celebration of
Growth and success. In an unexpected way, it had delivered exactly that, not for Chen Digital Marketing Solutions, but for the former employee they'd decided wasn't essential to their future. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated isn't proving people wrong, but proving yourself right in ways they never imagined possible. As I pulled into my San Diego driveway that night, I realized that the whispered conversations about my supposed downfall had been replaced by requests for my business card and invitations to discuss potential collaborations. The mayor's public recognition had reframed my story from cautionary tale to success story, and the evening had ended with several promising leads for expanding my consulting practice. The reunion had been intended to celebrate Chen Digital's achievements, but it had become an unexpected showcase for the community impact that strategic thinking and independent execution could create. Sometimes the greatest success comes not from being included in someone else's vision, but from having the courage to build your own. The drive back to San Diego that night gave me 47 miles to think about how I'd ended up in a situation where my former employer's celebration had accidentally become my public vindication. My name is Jessica Martinez, and 3 years ago I thought I understood how professional success worked. You joined a company, contributed your skills, built relationships, and eventually earned recognition that translated into advancement and security. It was a simple equation that had guided every career decision I'd made since graduating from UC Riverside with my MBA in digital marketing. Chen Digital Marketing Solutions had seemed like the perfect place to apply that equation when I joined them in January of 2019. Robert Chen had built the company from nothing after losing his corporate position during the 2008 financial crisis, and by the time I arrived, they were handling digital campaigns for mid-sized businesses throughout Riverside County. The company occupied a modest office space in a converted warehouse, with exposed brick walls and an open floor plan that encouraged collaboration. There were 12 employees when I started, each one wearing multiple professional hats and taking pride in the scrappy entrepreneurial energy that Robert fostered. My official title was Senior Account Manager, but like everyone else at Chen Digital, my actual responsibilities extended far beyond what any job description could capture. I managed client relationships, developed campaign strategies, analyzed performance metrics, coordinated with external vendors, and occasionally helped Linda Chen with administrative tasks when deadline pressures mounted. The variety was energizing after my previous role at a corporate marketing firm where my responsibilities had been narrowly defined and creativity was discouraged in favor of standardized processes. Robert Chen presented himself as someone who valued initiative and rewarded results. During my interview, he'd emphasized that Chen Digital was a place where talented people could grow without being constrained by corporate bureaucracy. "We're building something special here," he'd told me, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who'd turned personal adversity into business opportunity. "I want people who see this as more than just a job. I want partners in creating something that lasts." The word partners had resonated with me, suggesting a level of ownership and investment that I'd never experienced in traditional employment situations. Linda Chen, Robert's wife and the company's operations manager, had been equally encouraging during the hiring process. She'd walked me through the office, introducing me to team members and explaining how each person contributed to the company's collaborative culture. "Robert and I believe in treating our employees like family," she'd said, pausing by the coffee station where several team members were discussing a client presentation. "When you succeed, we all succeed. When we grow, everyone benefits." It was exactly the kind of professional environment I'd been searching for, a place where individual contributions were valued and collective success was shared. The stakes had felt significant from my first day. I was 28 years old, ambitious, and eager to prove that my combination of analytical skills and creative thinking could generate real value for clients and the company. My previous corporate role had provided steady income and good benefits, but I'd felt increasingly frustrated by the limited opportunities for advancement and the rigid hierarchy that separated strategic decision-making from day-to-day execution. Joining Chen Digital represented a calculated risk, trading corporate security for entrepreneurial opportunity. Within my first 6 months, I'd justified Robert's decision to hire me by landing 3 new clients and improving retention rates across my existing accounts. The Henderson Industries account, which became our largest contract, came through a referral from a college friend who'd been impressed by a campaign strategy I developed for her nonprofit organization. Henderson was expanding their operations into Southern California and needed a marketing partner who could develop a comprehensive digital presence while maintaining their established brand identity. The project required exactly the kind of strategic thinking and meticulous execution that I'd been hoping to demonstrate. The Henderson campaign became a showcase for everything Chen Digital could accomplish when given the opportunity to work with a client who valued innovation over convention. I spent 3 months researching their industry, analyzing their competitors, and developing a multi-platform strategy that would differentiate their brand while appealing to their target demographics. The campaign included social media content, search engine optimization, email marketing sequences, and a complete website redesign that improved user engagement by 62% within the first quarter. More importantly, the Henderson success opened doors to other opportunities. Their industry connections led to referrals from companies who'd seen the results we'd generated, and within 18 months, I was managing accounts that represented nearly 40% of Chen Digital's total revenue. The growth was gratifying professionally and financially, as Robert had implemented a commission structure that rewarded account managers for both acquiring new clients and maintaining existing relationships. But the stakes extended beyond individual career advancement. I genuinely believed that I was helping to build something meaningful, a company that could demonstrate how smaller firms could compete with corporate agencies by providing more personalized service and innovative solutions. Chen Digital's success felt like validation of the entrepreneurial approach to business, where creativity and client relationships mattered more than corporate processes and standardized deliverables. The personal stakes were equally significant. I'd moved back to Riverside after completing my MBA, choosing to stay close to family and friends rather than pursuing opportunities in Los Angeles or San Francisco. The decision had been partially financial, as the cost of living in Riverside allowed me to save money and pay down student loans more aggressively than would have been possible in larger metropolitan areas. But it was also emotional, as I valued the community connections and slower pace of life that came with living in a mid-sized city. Working for Chen Digital allowed me to have the best of both professional worlds. I was doing sophisticated marketing work for interesting clients, but I was also contributing to the economic development of my own community. Many of our clients were Riverside-based businesses, and I took pride in helping local companies compete more effectively in increasingly digital marketplaces. The work felt purposeful in ways that corporate marketing had never achieved, connecting my professional skills to outcomes that benefited people and places I cared about. The family atmosphere that Robert and Linda Chen cultivated extended beyond workplace policies to genuine personal relationships. I was invited to company barbecues at their home, included in holiday celebrations, and consulted on business decisions that went beyond my specific account responsibilities. Linda often asked for my opinions on operational improvements, and Robert increasingly involved me in strategic planning conversations about the company's long-term growth trajectory. Those relationships made the eventual betrayal more devastating than a typical employment disappointment. I hadn't just lost a job when Robert terminated me in September of 2021. I'd lost what I thought was a professional family, a community of people who shared common goals and mutual respect. The termination forced me to confront the possibility that I'd misunderstood the nature of those relationships, that what I'd experienced as genuine partnership had actually been strategic management of a valuable employee. Part 3. The unexpected response. The afternoon of my termination, I drove home to my apartment complex in complete silence. No radio, no phone calls, no internal monologue trying to process what had just happened. Sometimes shock manifests as emotional numbness, and that's exactly what I experienced during the 20-minute drive through familiar Riverside streets that suddenly felt like foreign territory. I parked in my assigned space, walked up 2 flights of stairs to my door, and sat down at my kitchen table with the cardboard box containing 3 years of desk accessories and personal items that had defined my professional life. Most people in my situation would have immediately called friends or family members to vent their frustration and seek emotional support. Others might have spent the evening researching employment lawyers or crafting angry emails to former colleagues. Some would have opened a bottle of wine and wallowed in self-pity while scrolling through job postings on LinkedIn. I did none of those things. Instead, I opened my laptop and began methodically documenting everything I could remember about my contributions to Chen Digital's success. The documentation process wasn't driven by thoughts of revenge or legal action. It was driven by a need to establish clarity about what had actually happened during my 3 years with the company, to create an objective record that couldn't be distorted by emotion or selective memory. I started with the Henderson Industries account, listing every aspect of the campaign development, implementation, and results. Then I moved to the Morrison Group project, the Riverside Chamber of Commerce contract, and each of the other significant accounts I'd managed or acquired. As I worked through the chronology of my contributions, patterns became clear that I'd been too busy to recognize while living them. Client acquisition had accelerated significantly during my tenure, with nearly 70% of new accounts coming through referrals from businesses I'd worked with successfully. Campaign performance metrics had improved consistently across all accounts, not just the ones I managed directly, suggesting that my strategies and processes were being adopted company-wide. Revenue growth had been strongest during quarters when I was leading new business development efforts. The documentation project consumed my entire weekend, but by Sunday evening, I had created a comprehensive record of my professional impact that was both detailed and undeniable. The folder included email screenshots, project timelines, client testimonials, performance reports, and financial summaries that painted a clear picture of someone who had been central to the company's growth and success. More importantly, the process had transformed my emotional state from shocked confusion to strategic clarity. Monday morning brought a different kind of awakening. Instead of getting dressed for my usual commute to the Chen Digital office, I put on jeans and a comfortable sweater and drove to Brew and Bean, the coffee shop near UC Riverside, where I'd spent countless hours as a graduate student. I ordered a large coffee, claimed a corner table with reliable Wi-Fi, and opened my laptop to begin researching something I'd never seriously considered before: starting my own consulting practice. The research was both intimidating and exhilarating. California's requirements for establishing a business were straightforward but extensive, involving state registration, local business licenses, tax identification numbers, and professional liability insurance. The financial considerations were more complex, as I'd need to maintain living expenses while building a client base, investing in necessary technology and software, and covering startup costs that I'd never had to calculate before. But the strategic considerations were what captured my attention most completely. During my 3 years at Chen Digital, I developed expertise in digital marketing strategies that were particularly effective for small and medium-sized businesses. I understood the challenges these companies faced in competing with larger corporations, and I'd proven my ability to develop cost-effective solutions that generated measurable results. Most importantly, I'd built relationships with business owners throughout Riverside County who had seen my work firsthand and trusted my professional judgment. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that independent consulting represented not just a viable alternative to traditional employment, but potentially a better fit for my skills and professional goals. I wouldn't have to navigate corporate politics or family dynamics that complicated decision-making. I wouldn't have to share credit for strategies I developed or watch other people get promoted based on work I'd accomplished. I would have direct relationships with clients who valued my contributions and paid me accordingly. That realization led to another unexpected decision. Instead of immediately starting the job search process or reaching out to my professional network for employment leads, I decided to spend 2 weeks developing a comprehensive business plan for Martinez Consulting Group. If I was going to make such a significant professional transition, I wanted to approach it with the same strategic thinking and thorough preparation that I brought to client projects. The business plan development process forced me to think systematically about market opportunities, competitive advantages, financial projections, and operational requirements in ways that I'd never had to consider as an employee. I researched the local consulting market, analyzed pricing structures for similar services, and identified potential clients who might be interested in the specialized expertise I could provide. The exercise was intellectually challenging and surprisingly enjoyable, combining analytical problem-solving with creative strategic thinking. By the end of my second week of unemployment, I had created a 30-page business plan that outlined a consulting practice focused on helping small businesses develop comprehensive digital marketing strategies. The plan included financial projections showing how I could achieve my previous salary within 12 months, operational procedures for client management and project delivery, and marketing strategies for building awareness of my services within the Riverside business community. More significantly, I'd identified my first potential client. David Kim owned 3 restaurants in downtown Riverside and had been struggling to compete with chain establishments that had larger marketing budgets and corporate support. I'd met David through a Chen Digital project 18 months earlier, and we'd maintained a friendly professional relationship even after that campaign concluded. David had mentioned several times that he wished he could afford ongoing marketing support, but the fees charged by agencies like Chen Digital were beyond his budget. I called David on a Tuesday afternoon, explaining that I was starting an independent consulting practice and would be interested in discussing his marketing challenges. He was immediately interested, particularly when I outlined a service model that would be more affordable than agency rates while providing more personalized attention than he could get from larger firms. We scheduled a meeting for the following Friday, and I spent the intervening days developing a proposal that would demonstrate exactly how strategic digital marketing could help his restaurants increase customer acquisition and retention. The meeting with David exceeded my expectations in every way. He was engaged with my analysis of his industry challenges, impressed by the strategic recommendations I'd developed, and enthusiastic about the potential for measurable improvement in his business results. More importantly, he understood the value proposition of working with an independent consultant who could provide agency-quality strategy at a price point that made sense for small business budgets. David signed a 6-month consulting contract that afternoon, providing me with both my first client and the confidence that my business model was viable. The financial terms weren't glamorous, but they were sufficient to cover my basic living expenses while I built additional client relationships. More importantly, the project would allow me to demonstrate my capabilities in a real-world setting while developing case studies that could be used to attract other clients. That evening, I completed the paperwork to officially establish Martinez Consulting Group as a California LLC. The process felt ceremonial in ways I hadn't anticipated, transforming weeks of planning and preparation into a legal business entity that represented my professional independence. I was no longer someone who had been terminated from Chen Digital Marketing Solutions. I was the founder and principal consultant of a new company that would compete in the same marketplace where I'd previously been an employee. The psychological transformation was as significant as the legal one. For 3 years, my professional identity had been defined by my relationship to Chen Digital and my role within their organizational structure. I'd been Robert Chen's senior account manager, Linda Chen's strategic advisor, Michael Chen's mentor, and the company's go-to person for complex client challenges. Suddenly I was simply Jessica Martinez, consultant, responsible for my own success and accountable only to clients who chose to work with me based on the value I could provide. The transition required adjustments that went far beyond business registration and client acquisition. I had to learn how to manage a regular income, handle my own benefits and retirement planning, and develop systems for tracking expenses and managing taxes. I had to create professional materials, establish office procedures, and build technology infrastructure that could support client work without the resources of a larger organization. But the most significant adjustment was psychological, learning to trust my own judgment and capabilities without the validation and support structure that comes with traditional employment. For the first time in my professional life, there was no supervisor to approve my strategies, no colleagues to provide feedback on my ideas, and no company policies to guide my decision-making. Success or failure would be determined entirely by my ability to deliver value to clients and build sustainable business relationships. Part 4. The awakening. 6 weeks into running Martinez Consulting Group, I experienced a moment of clarity that retroactively explained everything that had happened during my final year at Chen Digital. I was working late on a Tuesday evening, developing a comprehensive digital strategy for David Kim's restaurants, when my phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Williams, a former colleague who still worked at Chen Digital. The message was brief but revealing. Thought you should know, Michael is taking full credit for the Henderson Industries campaign renewal. Says he developed the original strategy and maintained the relationship throughout. I stared at the message for several minutes, not because the information was surprising, but because it crystallized a pattern I'd been unconsciously recognizing for months. This wasn't an isolated incident of Michael taking undeserved credit. This was the systematic rewriting of my professional contributions, a process that had begun long before my termination and had apparently continued after my departure. What I'd initially interpreted as typical workplace politics was actually something more deliberate, the methodical erasure of my role in the company's success stories. The Henderson Industries campaign had been my signature achievement at Chen Digital, the project that had established my reputation as a strategic thinker and demonstrated my ability to deliver results that exceeded client expectations. I had spent 3 months researching their industry, developing competitor analyses, and creating a multi-platform approach that addressed their specific market challenges. The campaign's success had generated a 62% increase in their qualified leads and had led to 3 additional contract renewals worth over $400,000 in total revenue. Michael Chen had been peripherally involved in the campaign, attending a few client meetings and providing input on creative elements, but he had not participated in the strategic development or day-to-day management that had made the project successful. For him to claim primary credit for both the original strategy and the ongoing relationship was not just professionally dishonest, it was a fundamental misrepresentation of what had actually happened. But Sarah's text message illuminated something more significant than one instance of stolen credit. It revealed that my termination hadn't been the beginning of Michael's ascension to greater responsibility, it had been the culmination of a longer process of positioning him as the strategic mind behind successes that I had actually generated. The systematic exclusion from meetings, the gradual reduction of my access to company systems, and the increasing emphasis on Michael's fresh perspectives hadn't been coincidental developments. They had been coordinated steps in a transition plan that required my contributions to be minimized in order to elevate his profile. The realization was both infuriating and liberating. Infuriating because it meant that my termination had been preceded by months of deliberate undermining that I'd been too trusting to recognize. Liberating because it confirmed that my decision to leave rather than fight for my position had been strategically sound. There had never been a path to fair treatment or appropriate recognition within the Chen family business structure. The only way to receive credit for my work was to do it independently. That night, I called Amanda Torres, my friend from graduate school who had become a successful organizational consultant. We'd maintained regular contact since my termination, and she'd been following my transition to independent consulting with professional interest and personal support. I explained Sarah's text message and my growing understanding of how systematically my contributions had been minimized during my final months at Chen Digital. Jessica, Amanda said after listening to my analysis, what you're describing isn't unusual in family businesses where ownership and management authority are conflated. Michael didn't just need to demonstrate competence to advance within the company, he needed to establish himself as the logical successor to his father's role. Your expertise and track record weren't just competition for recognition, they were obstacles to the narrative that he was ready for greater responsibility. Her explanation provided a framework for understanding dynamics that had seemed personally directed but were actually structurally inevitable. In a family business, non-family employees could never truly be partners, regardless of their contributions or the rhetoric about treating employees like family. At best, they could be valuable resources whose expertise supported family members' advancement. At worst, they could become threats to succession plans that prioritized bloodline over performance. The good news, Amanda continued, is that you recognized the situation and extracted yourself before it became more damaging to your professional reputation. Many people in similar circumstances spend years trying to prove their worth to employers who have already decided their contributions are expendable. You chose to bet on yourself instead of waiting for them to acknowledge your value. Her perspective helped me understand why my transition to independent consulting had felt so natural despite the initial uncertainty and financial risk. I hadn't just been escaping a problematic employment situation, I'd been reclaiming control over my professional narrative and my ability to benefit directly from the value I created. The work I was doing for David Kim's restaurants was generating results that were immediately attributable to my strategies and execution. There was no intermediary taking credit, no family dynamics complicating decision-making, and no question about who deserved recognition for successful outcomes. The awakening extended beyond understanding the Chen Digital situation to recognizing patterns in my entire professional history. I had consistently been drawn to roles where I could contribute to something larger than myself, whether that was helping nonprofit organizations achieve their missions or supporting small businesses compete more effectively in challenging markets. But I had also consistently found myself in situations where my contributions were undervalued or inappropriately credited to others. The corporate marketing role I'd held before joining Chen Digital had involved similar dynamics, with senior managers receiving recognition for strategies that had been developed by junior staff members. My nonprofit work during graduate school had included projects where board members took credit for fundraising campaigns that I had researched, planned, and executed. Even some of my academic experiences had involved professors who published research based on work that graduate students had performed without receiving appropriate acknowledgement. What I was beginning to understand was that these experiences weren't isolated incidents of bad management or unfair treatment. They were systemic features of organizational structures that concentrated authority and recognition at the top, while depending on the contributions of people who had little power to claim credit for their work. The solution wasn't to find better employers or more ethical organizations, it was to create professional arrangements where my contributions could be directly rewarded and appropriately recognized. Independent consulting provided exactly that kind of professional arrangement. My clients hired me based on my expertise and track record, paid me directly for the value I provided, and had no incentive to minimize my contributions or attribute my successes to other people. The relationships were clean, straightforward, and based on mutual benefit rather than complex organizational politics or family dynamics. 3 months after receiving Sarah's text message about Michael's credit claiming, I had a portfolio of 6 clients and was generating monthly revenue that exceeded my previous salary at Chen Digital. More importantly, I was building a professional reputation based entirely on my own work, with client testimonials and case studies that provided undeniable evidence of my capabilities and results. The transformation from employee to entrepreneur had required me to develop skills and confidence that I'd never needed in traditional employment situations. I was responsible for my own business development, financial management, and professional development in ways that were initially overwhelming but ultimately empowering. Every client relationship I built, every successful project I completed, and every referral I received was direct validation of my professional value. But the most significant aspect of the awakening was recognizing that what had felt like personal rejection from the Chen family was actually professional liberation from a situation that had been limiting my potential.
Robert Chen's decision to terminate me had forced me to confront limitations I'd been accepting and to pursue opportunities I'd been postponing. Michael Chen's credit claiming had revealed dynamics I'd been rationalizing and had motivated me to create professional arrangements where such behavior was impossible. The awakening wasn't just about understanding what had happened at Chen Digital, it was about recognizing what was possible when I stopped waiting for other people to acknowledge my worth and started building systems that rewarded it directly. The consulting practice wasn't just a career change, it was a fundamental shift in how I approached professional relationships and personal agency. Part 5.
The system revealed understanding the Chen family business dynamics required me to step back from my personal experience and analyze the structural forces that had shaped my 3 years with the company. Family businesses operate according to different rules than traditional corporations, with loyalty, succession planning, and personal relationships often taking precedence over standard performance metrics and professional development pathways. What I had initially interpreted as welcoming inclusion in a close-knit team was actually careful management of a valuable non-family employee who could contribute to the business without threatening established hierarchies. Robert Chen had built his company according to principles that made perfect sense from his perspective as founder and patriarch. He wanted to create economic security for his family while building a business that could provide his son with meaningful career opportunities and eventual ownership. The rhetoric about treating employees like family wasn't dishonest, but it was incomplete. Employees could be valued family members, but they could never be inheriting family members, and that distinction ultimately determined how contributions were recognized and how opportunities were distributed. The system had worked effectively during Chen Digital's early growth phase, when the company was small enough that everyone's contributions were visible and the business needed every employee to perform at high levels. Robert's collaborative management style and Linda's attention to workplace culture had created an environment where people felt appreciated and motivated to exceed their job descriptions. The family atmosphere had been genuine during those years because the business success depended on everyone working together toward common goals. But as the company grew and Michael's graduation from USC approached, the system's priorities shifted in ways that were subtle but significant. The business no longer needed every employee to wear multiple hats, which meant that roles could become more specialized and hierarchical. More importantly, the company needed to prepare for a succession transition that would position Michael as Robert's eventual replacement, which required demonstrating his competence and leadership potential to clients, employees, and external stakeholders. Michael's integration into the company had been carefully orchestrated to support these succession goals. He wasn't hired as an entry-level employee who would need to prove himself through years of gradually increasing responsibility. He was positioned as a strategic contributor whose insights and perspectives would help the company evolve and grow. His educational credentials and family connections provided him with immediate credibility that other employees had needed years to establish through their work performance. The system's logic became clear when I understood that my role had never been to become a partner or senior leader within Chen Digital. My role was to provide expertise and stability during Michael's transition period, helping him learn the business while maintaining client relationships and operational continuity. Once he had developed sufficient knowledge and confidence to handle major accounts independently, my continued presence became unnecessary and potentially problematic. This wasn't necessarily conscious manipulation or deliberate deception. Robert and Linda Chen likely believed they were managing a natural business evolution that would benefit everyone involved. Michael probably assumed that his increasing responsibility reflected his growing competence rather than a predetermined succession plan. The system operated according to its own internal logic, with each person playing their assigned role without necessarily understanding how their individual actions contributed to larger organizational dynamics. But the system's impact on non-family employees was predictable and harmful. People like me who excelled in their roles and contributed significantly to company success would inevitably reach a ceiling that had nothing to do with their performance or potential. The harder we worked and the more successful we became, the more we threatened the narrative that family members were the company's primary source of strategic insight and leadership capability. The clearest evidence of the system's limitations was how my expertise and achievements had been gradually reframed during my final year with the company. The Henderson Industries campaign, which had been a solo project during its development phase, became a collaborative effort when discussing it with clients and external partners. My role in developing new business processes was minimized in favor of emphasizing Michael's contributions to process improvement. Client relationships that I had built and maintained were increasingly presented as company assets rather than individual accomplishments. This reframing wasn't accidental or incidental. It was necessary for maintaining the system's credibility as Michael assumed greater responsibility. If my contributions were acknowledged at their full value, it would raise questions about why I wasn't being promoted to senior leadership positions. If my expertise was presented as indispensable, it would undermine confidence in Michael's ability to manage major accounts independently. The system required my marginalization in order to support his elevation. The financial aspects of the system were equally revealing.
When Chen Digital needed a co-signer for their expansion loan, they approached me not because I was a valued partner whose investment would be appropriately rewarded, but because I was a valuable employee whose financial stability could be leveraged to support the company's growth. The co-signing arrangement provided them with access to better loan terms while giving me no ownership stake or formal voice in how the borrowed money would be used. The loan situation perfectly illustrated the system's approach to non-family employees. We could be trusted with significant financial responsibility when it benefited the company, but we couldn't be trusted with strategic decision-making authority that might conflict with family interests. We could provide expertise that generated revenue and reduced risk, but we couldn't expect to benefit proportionally from the success we helped create. Understanding the system's logic helped me recognize why my termination had been handled with such apparent indifference to my contributions and achievements. From Robert Chen's perspective, he wasn't dismissing a valuable partner or strategic asset. He was making a personnel decision that prioritized his son's development over a non-family employee's career aspirations. The decision was consistent with the system's values and objectives, even if it seemed arbitrary and unfair from my perspective. The system also explained why my departure had created such significant operational challenges for Chen Digital. They had become dependent on my expertise and client relationships while simultaneously minimizing my role in their success narratives. When I left, they lost institutional knowledge and established business relationships that couldn't be easily replaced, but they couldn't acknowledge the extent of that loss without contradicting the story they'd been telling about Michael's readiness for greater responsibility. Most importantly, understanding the system helped me recognize that my experience at Chen Digital wasn't unique or personal. Family businesses throughout the economy operated according to similar logic, creating opportunities for non-family employees to contribute and advance until those contributions conflicted with succession planning priorities. The system wasn't malicious, but it was inherently limiting for people who weren't born into the family structure. This recognition was professionally liberating because it eliminated any lingering questions about whether I could have handled the situation differently or achieved different outcomes through better performance or more strategic positioning. The system's constraints were structural, not personal, and no amount of individual effort or political maneuvering could have changed the fundamental dynamics that prioritized family relationships over professional merit. The system revelation also provided clarity about why independent consulting had felt so immediately comfortable and rewarding. Client relationships based on contractual agreements and measurable results operated according to transparent rules where performance was directly rewarded and contributions were appropriately credited. There were no hidden hierarchies or succession planning considerations that could undermine professional relationships or distort recognition of achievements. Working within the Chen Digital system had taught me valuable lessons about organizational dynamics, client management, and strategic planning, but it had also taught me about the limitations of traditional employment relationships. The most important lesson was that professional fulfillment and financial success required alignment between individual contributions and organizational rewards, something that family business systems could rarely provide for non-family employees regardless of their capabilities or commitment. The true scope of my contributions to Chen Digital's success only became clear to me after I'd spent months working independently and could view my previous role with the objectivity that distance provides. During my 3 years with the company, I'd been too immersed in daily operations and too focused on immediate project demands to step back and assess the cumulative impact of my work. It wasn't until I was building case studies for my consulting practice that I realized how extensively my efforts had shaped virtually every aspect of the company's growth and development. The financial numbers told the most compelling story. When I joined Chen Digital in January 2019, the company's annual revenue was approximately $800,000, generated primarily through small local accounts and occasional project work for regional businesses. By the time of my departure in September 2021, annual revenue had exceeded $2.4 million, representing a 300% increase over 32 months. While multiple factors contributed to that growth, my analysis of client acquisition patterns, contract values, and retention rates revealed that accounts I'd managed or acquired directly represented 68% of the company's total revenue at the time of my termination. The Henderson Industries contract alone illustrated how significantly individual relationships could impact overall business performance. When I'd first contacted Henderson about their digital marketing needs, they were spending approximately $15,000 annually on advertising with minimal measurable results.
The comprehensive strategy I developed for their Southern California expansion had led to an initial contract worth $85,000, followed by 3 renewal agreements that had increased in scope and value each year. By 2021, Henderson Industries was paying Chen Digital nearly $200,000 annually for ongoing marketing support, making them the company's largest single client. But the Henderson relationship represented more than just direct revenue. Their success story had become Chen Digital's primary marketing asset, the case study that Robert Chen referenced in nearly every new business presentation. The campaign's measurable results, documented through detailed analytics and client testimonials, provided credibility that helped the company compete for larger accounts against more established agencies. Henderson's willingness to serve as a reference client had been instrumental in landing several other significant contracts, creating a multiplier effect that extended far beyond the direct financial value of their account. The Morrison Group project had followed a similar pattern, though with different strategic challenges that had required entirely different solutions. Morrison operated a chain of specialty retail stores throughout Riverside and San Bernardino counties, and they'd been struggling to maintain customer loyalty as online competition intensified. Traditional advertising approaches weren't generating sufficient return on investment, and their existing marketing efforts lacked the cohesive brand messaging needed to differentiate them from national competitors. I'd spent 6 weeks conducting customer research, analyzing purchasing patterns, and developing a comprehensive digital strategy that integrated social media marketing, email campaigns, search engine optimization, and local community engagement initiatives. The project had required coordination with external vendors, extensive staff training for Morrison's team, and ongoing performance monitoring that continued for 18 months after the initial implementation. The results had exceeded everyone's expectations, with customer retention improving by 41% and average transaction values increasing by 27% within the first year. The Morrison success had generated additional opportunities that demonstrated how strategic client relationships could create sustained business growth. 3 other retail chains had hired Chen Digital based specifically on the Morrison case study, and 2 of those accounts had become long-term relationships that were still active at the time of my departure. The cumulative value of Morrison-related business had exceeded $400,000, all stemming from my initial research and strategy development. Beyond major client accounts, my contributions had extended to operational improvements that had enhanced the company's efficiency and profitability across all projects. The project management system I'd implemented had reduced average campaign development time by 35% while improving quality control and client communication. The client onboarding process I'd designed had increased contract signing rates by 28% and had virtually eliminated the scope creep issues that had previously caused budget overruns and timeline delays. The staff training programs I'd developed had been particularly significant during Chen Digital's expansion phase. As the company grew from 12 employees to 26, maintaining consistent service quality and brand standards became increasingly challenging. I'd created comprehensive training materials, established performance metrics, and implemented review processes that ensured new team members could contribute effectively while maintaining the collaborative culture that clients valued. Several employees had told me that my training programs had been more valuable than their formal education in preparing them for professional success. My role in financial management had been equally invisible but critically important. I'd negotiated vendor contracts that had reduced the company's operational costs by approximately $60,000 annually, researched and implemented new software solutions that had improved productivity and eliminated redundant expenses, and developed budget forecasting models that had helped Robert Chen make more informed strategic decisions. The expansion loan that I'd co-signed had been possible partly because of the financial stability and growth projections that my operational improvements had made achievable. The client retention work had been perhaps the most valuable but least recognized aspect of my contributions. Maintaining long-term relationships with existing clients required ongoing attention to changing needs, proactive communication about performance metrics, and continuous optimization of campaign strategies based on market conditions and business developments. This work didn't generate new business headlines or dramatic success stories, but it provided the revenue stability that allowed Chen Digital to invest in growth initiatives and weather periodic downturns in new client acquisition. My retention efforts had kept client turnover below 8% annually, compared to industry averages that typically exceeded 20% for agencies of similar size and scope. This stability had allowed the company to plan more effectively, invest in employee development, and pursue larger projects that required sustained resource commitments. The cumulative financial impact of improved retention rates had been substantial, representing hundreds of thousands of dollars in sustained revenue that might otherwise have been lost to competitor agencies. The business development activities I'd undertaken had extended beyond direct client acquisition to community engagement and industry relationship building that had enhanced Chen Digital's reputation and referral network. I'd represented the company at Riverside Chamber of Commerce events, participated in local business roundtables, and maintained relationships with complementary service providers who could refer potential clients or collaborate on larger projects. These activities had generated dozens of qualified leads over 3 years, many of which had converted to significant client relationships. My writing and content development work had been similarly invisible but strategically important. The company's website content, case studies, proposal templates, and marketing materials had all been substantially improved through my research and writing efforts. These materials had been used in hundreds of client presentations and had contributed to Chen Digital's professional credibility in ways that were difficult to quantify but undeniably valuable. The website content alone had improved search engine rankings and organic lead generation substantially enough to reduce the company's dependence on paid advertising. The vendor relationship management I'd handled had created operational efficiencies and cost savings that had accumulated significantly over time. I'd researched alternative suppliers for everything from printing services to software licenses, negotiated better terms with existing vendors, and established backup relationships that had prevented service disruptions during peak demand periods. These efforts had required extensive time and attention but had generated savings and improvements that had benefited every project and client relationship. My involvement in strategic planning had been substantial but rarely formally acknowledged. Robert Chen had consulted me regularly about expansion decisions, staffing needs, technology investments, and competitive positioning, treating me as a trusted advisor whose insights informed major business decisions. I'd researched market opportunities, analyzed competitor strategies, and developed recommendations that had shaped the company's direction during critical growth periods. These contributions had been valued and utilized, but they hadn't been formally recognized or appropriately compensated. The training and mentorship I'd provided to other employees had been particularly extensive during Michael Chen's integration into the company. Beyond the formal orientation activities that Linda Chen had requested, I'd spent dozens of hours helping Michael understand client relationships, industry dynamics, and operational procedures that weren't documented in any company manual. This knowledge transfer had been essential for his professional development, but it had also required me to share expertise and relationships that I'd developed through years of experience and effort. The administrative responsibilities I'd assumed had been necessary for the company's smooth operation but had rarely been acknowledged as significant contributions. I'd handled client contract reviews, insurance policy research, compliance documentation, and countless other tasks that had allowed Robert and Linda Chen to focus on strategic priorities rather than operational details. This work had been time-intensive and professionally demanding, but it had been treated as routine support rather than specialized expertise. Looking back with the perspective that independent consulting had provided, I could see how extensively my contributions had been woven into every aspect of Chen Digital's operations and success. The company I'd left in September 2021 had been fundamentally different from the one I'd joined in January 2019, and my work had been central to that transformation. Revenue had tripled, operational efficiency had improved dramatically, client relationships had been strengthened and expanded, and the company's market position had been enhanced through strategic improvements that I'd researched, planned, and implemented. But perhaps most significantly, my contributions had created the foundation that had made Michael Chen's advancement possible. The client relationships I'd built provided him with established accounts to manage and learn from. The operational systems I'd developed gave him frameworks for handling complex projects efficiently. The strategic insights I'd generated offered him models for approaching new challenges and opportunities. In many ways, my 3 years of work had created the professional environment that had allowed him to demonstrate competence and assume greater responsibility. The irony was profound and painful. My invisible contributions had not only driven the company's success, but had also created the conditions that had made my position expendable. By building systems, relationships, and processes that could function without my direct involvement, I'd essentially engineered my own obsolescence within the organization. The very thoroughness and professionalism that I'd brought to every project had enabled my replacement by someone with less experience but greater family connections. Part 7, The False Promise Period. The 18 months between Michael Chen's arrival at the company and my eventual termination represented the most professionally fulfilling period of my career, which made the ultimate outcome even more devastating when I finally understood what had actually been happening. During this time, I genuinely believed that my demonstrated competence and sustained contributions were building toward a partnership opportunity or senior leadership role that would reflect my actual value to the organization. The encouragement I received from Robert and Linda Chen seemed to confirm that my long-term future with the company was secure and promising. The false promise period began with a conversation in Robert Chen's office in March 2020, approximately 6 months after Michael had joined the team. I'd just completed the preliminary research phase for the Henderson Industries campaign, and the client had expressed enthusiasm about our strategic approach that exceeded their initial expectations. Robert had called me in to discuss not just the Henderson project, but what he described as my evolving role within the company's growth trajectory. "Jessica, you've become indispensable to our success," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he was delivering good news. "Linda and I have been discussing how to better recognize your contributions and provide opportunities that match your capabilities." He'd paused dramatically, clearly enjoying the moment. "We're thinking about creating a Director of Strategic Development position that would give you oversight of all major client relationships and new business initiatives. It would come with equity participation and a seat on our advisory board." The conversation had felt like validation of everything I'd been working towards since joining Chen Digital. A director-level position would provide the professional recognition I'd been seeking, while equity participation would align my interests with the company's long-term success in ways that traditional salary arrangements couldn't achieve. More importantly, a seat on the advisory board would give me formal input into strategic decisions that I'd been informally influencing through my relationship with Robert and Linda. The transition would happen gradually, Robert had continued, probably over the next 12 to 18 months as we solidify our expansion plans and Michael becomes more familiar with our operational procedures. "We want to make sure everyone's ready for the increased responsibilities that growth will require." The timeline had seemed reasonable, even conservative, given the complexity of restructuring roles and responsibilities within a growing organization. Linda Chen had reinforced these expectations during several subsequent conversations, emphasizing how much she and Robert valued my judgment and wanted to ensure my long-term commitment to the company. "You've become like family to us," she'd said during one of our weekly check-ins. "We want to make sure you feel as invested in our future as we feel about yours." Her words had carried genuine warmth, and I'd believed that the family dynamic she described was mutual and meaningful. The Henderson Industries campaign success had seemed to accelerate these discussions. When the client had renewed their contract with expanded scope and significantly increased budget, Robert had praised my strategic insight and execution capabilities in terms that suggested formal advancement was imminent. "This is exactly the kind of thinking we need at the leadership level," he'd told me after the Henderson renewal meeting. "You're demonstrating why our director-level discussion makes so much sense." Michael's presence during these conversations had initially seemed supportive rather than competitive. He'd often expressed appreciation for my mentorship and had demonstrated genuine interest in learning from my experience with client relationship management. "Jessica's been incredibly helpful in teaching me how to think strategically about client needs," he'd told his father during one team meeting. "I feel like I'm getting a master class in professional consulting." His comments had reinforced my belief that we were building a collaborative leadership structure rather than competing for limited advancement opportunities. The false promise period had been sustained by concrete evidence that seemed to support the director-level trajectory Robert had outlined. I'd been included in strategic planning meetings that had previously involved only the Chen family members. My recommendations about staffing, technology investments, and market expansion had been implemented with minimal modification. Client contracts had begun including language that specifically mentioned my ongoing involvement in account management, suggesting that my role was being formalized in ways that clients could recognize and value. The financial discussions had been particularly encouraging. Robert had consulted me about the expansion loan application process, asking for my input on terms, timeline, and risk assessment. When the bank had requested additional guarantors, his decision to approach me had felt like evidence of trust and partnership rather than simply a convenient solution to a financing requirement. "You're an integral part of our growth strategy," he'd explained when asking me to co-sign. "It makes sense for you to have a formal stake in our expansion success." My willingness to provide personal financial backing for the expansion had been based partly on the equity participation discussions we'd been having. If I was going to become a partner with ownership stake in the company, co-signing the expansion loan represented an investment in my own future rather than simply a favor for my employer. The financial risk had seemed
manageable given the potential long-term benefits of formal partnership arrangements. The operational changes during this period had further reinforced my belief that leadership advancement was inevitable. I'd been given responsibility for hiring decisions, budget allocation for major projects, and vendor relationship management that typically required senior-level authority. My email signature had been updated to include Senior Strategic Advisor as a title that reflected my expanded responsibilities, and clients had been notified that I would be their primary contact for all strategic initiatives. The false promise period had also included informal social recognition that had felt like preparation for formal role changes. Robert and Linda had begun including me in family gatherings that went beyond typical company events, inviting me to Michael's birthday celebration and including me in holiday dinners at their home. These invitations had felt like evidence that I was transitioning from employee to extended family member, with all the security and opportunity that such relationships might provide. Michael's professional development during this period had seemed complementary to rather than competitive with my advancement trajectory. He'd been focusing on creative and technical aspects of campaign development while I'd been handling strategic planning and client relationship management. The division of responsibilities had felt natural and sustainable, with each of us contributing different but equally valuable expertise to the company's service offerings. The client feedback during this period had consistently reinforced the value of my strategic contributions. Henderson Industries had specifically praised my analytical approach and ongoing account management in their renewal discussions. Morrison Group had credited my research and implementation oversight with exceeding their performance expectations. Several other clients had mentioned in testimonials that my involvement had been central to their satisfaction with Chen Digital's services. The industry recognition I'd begun receiving had also supported my belief that senior-level advancement was appropriate and overdue. The Riverside Chamber of Commerce had invited me to speak about digital marketing trends at their quarterly business breakfast. Local business publications had interviewed me about small business growth strategies. Professional associations had asked me to participate in panel discussions about effective client relationship management. This external validation had seemed to confirm what Robert and Linda had been telling me about my leadership potential. The false promise period had reached its peak during the summer of 2021, when discussions about the Director of Strategic Development position had become increasingly specific. Robert had asked me to develop a job description and organizational chart that would formalize my expanded responsibilities. Linda had begun referring to me as our future partner in conversations with clients and vendors. The advisory board participation had been mentioned in client presentations as evidence of Chen Digital's strategic planning capabilities. But even during this period of apparent progress toward partnership, there had been subtle signs that I'd been too optimistic to recognize as warning signals. Michael's involvement in client presentations had been gradually increasing, with him assuming co-facilitator roles for meetings that I'd previously managed independently. Strategic documents that I'd developed had begun including his name as co-author, even when his contributions had been minimal. Client emails that had previously been directed to me exclusively had started copying him on all communications. The most significant warning sign had been the gradual shift in how my contributions were discussed in company meetings and client presentations. Successes that had previously been attributed to my individual efforts were increasingly described as team accomplishments or collaborative initiatives. The Henderson campaign, which had been presented as my strategic achievement during the early stages of our director-level discussions, was gradually reframed as an example of Chen Digital's collaborative approach to client service. By late summer 2021, the false promise period was ending, though I didn't recognize the transition until after my termination. The director position discussions had become less frequent and more vague. The equity participation conversations had been postponed pending organizational restructuring that never seemed to materialize. The advisory board seat had been described as something that would happen when the timing was right rather than according to any specific timeline. Looking back with the clarity that distance provides, I can see that the false promise period had served specific purposes that had nothing to do with my actual advancement prospects. It had maintained my engagement and productivity during a critical growth phase when the company needed my expertise and client relationships. It had provided justification for asking me to co-sign the expansion loan, linking my financial commitment to supposed partnership opportunities.
Most importantly, it had kept me focused on company success rather than personal career development, preventing me from pursuing external opportunities that might have been more aligned with my professional goals. The false promise period had been sustained by my own desire to believe that loyalty and performance would eventually be rewarded appropriately. I'd interpreted ambiguous statements optimistically, overlooked warning signs that contradicted my preferred narrative, and assumed that the partnership discussions represented genuine intentions rather than strategic employee management. My willingness to believe in the promises had made the eventual termination not just professionally disappointing but personally devastating. Part 8. The setup. You missed the most painful aspect of my eventual termination wasn't the loss of the job itself, but the recognition that I had unknowingly spent months providing Michael Chen with everything he needed to replace me effectively. What I had interpreted as mentorship and collaborative teamwork had actually been a systematic knowledge transfer that had prepared him to assume my responsibilities while gradually marginalizing my role within the organization. The setup had been so subtle and had felt so natural that I'd never questioned whether my generous sharing of expertise and relationships might ultimately be used against my own interests. The process had begun innocuously during Michael's first month with the company, when Robert had asked me to help his son understand the nuances of client relationship management that weren't taught in business school curricula. "You've developed such effective approaches to client communication and project management," Robert had said. "Michael could really benefit from learning your methods before he starts managing accounts independently." The request had felt like professional recognition, an acknowledgement that I'd developed valuable expertise that deserved to be preserved and transmitted within the organization. I'd embraced the mentoring role enthusiastically, creating detailed documentation of my client management processes, strategic planning methodologies, and campaign development frameworks. The materials I'd prepared had been comprehensive enough to serve as training manuals for any new employee, but I'd tailored them specifically to help Michael understand the thinking behind my approaches rather than just the mechanical procedures. I'd wanted him to succeed not just as Robert's son, but as a professional colleague whose success would reflect well on my training and judgment. The client introduction process had been where my generosity had been most systematically exploited. Over the course of 6 months, I'd gradually included Michael in client meetings, conference calls, and project planning sessions that had previously been my exclusive responsibility. The introductions had felt natural and appropriate, a way of ensuring continuity and giving clients confidence that their accounts would receive consistent attention as the company grew and evolved. But the introduction process had also transferred relationships that I'd spent years building to someone who could leverage them without acknowledging their origin. The Henderson Industries contact, who had initially worked exclusively with me, had become comfortable communicating with Michael about routine project updates. The Morrison Group executives, who had trusted my strategic recommendations, had begun seeking his input on campaign modifications and budget adjustments. These relationship transfers had felt like successful mentorship at the time, but they had also eliminated my unique value proposition within the organization. The strategic planning sessions I'd included Michael in had been particularly damaging to my long-term position, though I'd been completely oblivious to the implications at the time. I'd shared my analysis frameworks, competitive research methodologies, and client needs assessment techniques with someone who could apply them independently without requiring my ongoing involvement. Worse, I'd explained the reasoning behind my strategic recommendations in ways that had allowed him to present similar insights as his own thinking rather than learned applications of my methods. The project management systems I'd developed and refined over 3 years had been completely documented and transferred during Michael's integration period. He'd learned how to coordinate complex campaigns, manage vendor relationships, monitor performance metrics, and handle client communications using processes that I'd created through trial and error and continuous improvement efforts. By the time of my termination, he could manage most projects using my systems without needing my expertise or involvement. The vendor relationships I'd carefully cultivated had been similarly transferred through what I'd thought was appropriate team building. I'd introduced Michael to key suppliers, explained the history and terms of various service agreements, and included him in negotiations for contract renewals and new service arrangements. These relationships had taken years to develop and had provided Chen Digital with favorable terms and reliable service quality, but once Michael understood how they functioned, my role in maintaining them had become redundant. Perhaps most significantly, I'd shared my understanding of client psychology and business dynamics that had made my strategic recommendations so effective. I'd explained how different decision makers responded to various presentation styles, which performance metrics mattered most to specific clients, and how to anticipate changing needs based on market conditions and business cycles. This knowledge had been developed through careful observation and analysis over years of client interaction, but once transmitted, it could be applied by someone else without requiring my continued involvement. The client communication templates and proposal frameworks I'd developed had been completely documented and shared during Michael's training period. He'd learned how to structure client presentations, write effective campaign briefs, and develop project timelines using formats that I'd refined based on extensive experience with successful and unsuccessful approaches. These materials had represented thousands of hours of professional development, but they could be utilized by anyone who understood their applications. The financial analysis and budgeting methodologies I'd created had been similarly transferred. Michael had learned how to develop cost estimates, allocate resources across multiple projects, and monitor campaign performance against budget projections using systems that I'd designed specifically for Chen Digital's client base and service offerings. The financial management expertise that had been one of my most valuable contributions could be replicated once the underlying frameworks and procedures were understood. The industry knowledge and competitive intelligence I'd accumulated had been shared through what I'd thought were strategic planning discussions, but had actually been educational sessions that had transferred my intellectual capital to someone who could use it independently. Michael had learned about market trends, competitor strategies, regulatory changes, and emerging opportunities through my research and analysis rather than developing his own information sources and analytical capabilities. The professional network I'd built within the Riverside business community had been gradually transferred through introductions and joint appearances at industry events. Michael had met potential clients, referral sources, and strategic partners through my existing relationships, gaining access to business development opportunities that had taken me years to cultivate. By the time of my termination, he had established independent relationships with many of the contacts who had been central to my professional effectiveness. The quality control standards and performance measurement systems I'd implemented had been documented and transferred in their entirety. Michael had learned how to evaluate campaign effectiveness, identify optimization opportunities, and maintain service quality standards using metrics and procedures that I'd developed through extensive testing and refinement. The operational expertise that had been essential to Chen Digital's reputation for reliable results could be maintained without my continued involvement. The crisis management protocols I'd created for handling client emergencies and project complications had been shared during training sessions that I'd thought were preparing Michael for collaborative problem solving. He'd learned how to manage timeline disruptions, budget overruns, performance shortfalls, and communication breakdowns using approaches that I'd developed through experience with various challenging situations. The crisis management capabilities that had been one of my most valuable skills could be replicated by someone who understood the underlying procedures. Looking back with the painful clarity that hindsight provides, I can see that the setup had been comprehensive and systematic. Every aspect of my professional value to Chen Digital had been documented, transferred, and replicated during what I'd thought was a mentorship and team-building process. By the time of my termination, Michael had acquired not just general business knowledge, but specifically the expertise, relationships, and capabilities that I'd developed during my 3 years with the company. The setup had been particularly effective because it had been presented as professional development and knowledge sharing rather than replacement preparation. I'd participated willingly and enthusiastically, believing that I was building collaborative capabilities that would enhance our collective effectiveness rather than creating redundancy that would eliminate my position. The mentorship framework had made the knowledge transfer feel mutually beneficial rather than exploitative. The irony was that my professional generosity and collaborative approach had been essential qualities that had made me valuable to Chen Digital, but they had also made me vulnerable to replacement once that value could be replicated. The very traits that had contributed to my success within the organization had been systematically used to engineer my obsolescence. I'd built the foundation for my own termination through my commitment to sharing knowledge and developing others' capabilities. Part 9, the first clear warning. The morning of July 15, 2021 began like dozens of others during what I now understand was the final phase of my tenure at Chen Digital. I arrived at the office at 7:30, reviewed my email while drinking coffee, and prepared for what I expected to be a routine client strategy meeting with the Morrison Group account team. The meeting had been scheduled for 3 weeks, and I'd spent considerable time developing recommendations for their fall campaign initiatives based on performance data from their summer promotions and emerging trends in their industry sector. What made this morning different was a seemingly insignificant detail that I almost overlooked. The calendar invitation for the Morrison Group meeting, which had originally listed me as the primary organizer and presenter, had been updated overnight to show Michael Chen as the meeting facilitator with me listed as a supporting participant. The change had been made without discussion or notification, and when I asked Linda Chen about it, she'd provided an explanation that was both plausible and unsettling. Robert thought it would be good for Michael to take the lead on presenting strategic recommendations, she'd said, not meeting my eyes as she sorted through invoice files at her desk. You'll still be there to provide input and answer technical questions, of course. It's just about giving him more client-facing experience with major accounts. Her tone had been casual, as if this was a minor scheduling adjustment rather than a fundamental shift in how my role was being positioned relative to significant client relationships. The Morrison Group meeting itself had been a masterclass in professional displacement that I was too shocked to fully comprehend in the moment. Michael had presented recommendations that were essentially identical to the strategy I'd developed, using analysis frameworks and presentation formats that I'd created, but with modifications that were significant enough to make the work appear to be his independent thinking rather than adapted versions of my original proposals. When Morrison's marketing director had asked about specific performance metrics that supported our recommendations, Michael had referred the question to me as if I was a technical specialist rather than the strategist who had developed the entire analytical foundation for our proposals. Jessica can provide more detail about the data analysis, he'd said, gesturing toward me with the casual authority of someone who was clearly the senior professional in the room. The demotion had been executed so smoothly that the client had accepted the new dynamic without question. But what had made the experience truly disturbing was recognizing how thoroughly my strategic thinking had been appropriated and repackaged. The competitive analysis section of Michael's presentation had included insights that I'd developed through months of research, but the sourcing had been attributed to our strategic planning team rather than my individual work. The customer segmentation approach had been based on methodologies that I'd refined through extensive testing with Morrison's specific market dynamics, but it had been presented as Chen Digital's standard analytical framework. Most painfully, the creative brief that formed the centerpiece of our recommendations had been based on customer psychology insights that I'd developed through careful observation and analysis during 18 months of working with Morrison's account. Michael had presented these insights as his understanding of the client's needs, demonstrating familiarity with nuances that he could only have acquired through our previous planning discussions. He'd appropriated not just my work product, but my professional judgment and analytical capabilities. After the meeting, I'd attempted to discuss the presentation dynamic with Robert Chen, expecting that he would recognize the inappropriateness of having my strategic work presented by someone else without acknowledgement. Instead, his response had been immediate and cutting, revealing an attitude that I'd been too naive to recognize during our previous interactions. Jessica, I'm concerned about what seems like territorial behavior regarding client presentations, he'd said, maintaining the calm tone that he used for discussing personnel issues. Michael handled the Morrison meeting professionally, and the client was satisfied with our recommendations. I hope you're not becoming possessive about work that benefits the entire company. The accusation had been delivered with the kind of psychological precision that made me question my own perceptions rather than his judgment. Robert, I'm not being territorial, I'd replied, struggling to maintain professional composure while processing what felt like an attack on my credibility and judgment. I'm concerned about how my strategic work is being presented and credited. The analysis and recommendations that Michael discussed were based on research and frameworks that I developed specifically for Morrison's needs. I think it's reasonable to expect appropriate attribution for that work. His response had been swift and definitive, establishing a dynamic that I'd somehow failed to recognize during our previous conversations about my advancement prospects. We don't operate with individual ownership of ideas here, he'd said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that discouraged further discussion. Everything we develop belongs to the company, and anyone on our team should be able to present our recommendations effectively. If you're not comfortable with collaborative approaches to client service, perhaps you should reconsider whether Chen Digital is the right fit for your professional style. The threat had been implicit but unmistakable. My concerns about appropriate credit for my work had been reframed as resistance to team collaboration, and my professional future had been positioned as contingent on my willingness to accept marginalization without complaint. The conversation had ended with Robert's suggestion that I focus on supporting Michael's development as a strategic presenter rather than competing with him for client attention. That afternoon had brought additional evidence that the Morrison meeting had been part of a broader pattern rather than an isolated incident. I discovered that my access to the company's client relationship management system had been modified to remove my ability to update client contact information or modify project timelines without supervisory approval. When I'd asked Linda Chen about the access changes, she'd explained that they were part of a security enhancement that required senior-level authorization for certain administrative functions. But the timing and specificity of the restrictions had been revealing. Michael retained full access to all client management functions, despite having been with the company for less than a year. The other account managers hadn't experienced any access limitations. The restrictions had been applied specifically to my user account, and they had affected precisely the functions that would have allowed me to maintain independent control over client relationships and project management. The email system changes had been equally significant, though initially less obvious. Messages from several major clients had begun being automatically forwarded to Michael's account in addition to mine, creating redundant communication streams that hadn't existed previously. When clients responded to project updates or requested information, their emails were reaching both of us simultaneously, effectively eliminating my exclusive relationship with accounts that I'd been managing independently for months or years. More troubling had been the discovery that outgoing email from my account was being automatically copied to a company archive folder that Michael could access. This meant that my client communications, vendor negotiations, and internal strategic discussions were being monitored and preserved in ways that could allow someone else to understand and replicate my professional relationships and decision-making processes. The vendor communication situation had provided the most concrete evidence that my professional relationships were being systematically transferred rather than simply supplemented. 3 suppliers who had worked exclusively with me for months had contacted Michael directly about contract renewals and service modifications, suggesting that they'd been instructed to redirect their communications despite having established working relationships with me. When I'd asked these vendors about the communication changes, their responses had been diplomatically vague, but consistently indicated that they'd received instructions from Chen Digital Management to include Michael in all future correspondence. The vendor relationships that I'd carefully developed and maintained were being transferred to someone else without my knowledge or consent, eliminating another aspect of my unique value to the organization. The client feedback management process had been similarly altered in ways that reduced my direct access to performance information and satisfaction data. Reports that had previously been sent to me exclusively were now being distributed to both Michael and me, with his email address listed first in the recipient order. Client satisfaction surveys that had mentioned my work specifically were being forwarded to Robert Chen for executive review before I received copies, creating a filtering process that could potentially suppress feedback that contradicted their evolving narrative about my role. The warning signs had been accumulating for weeks before the Morrison Group meeting, but that presentation had crystallized the pattern in ways that made denial impossible. My strategic work was being appropriated and reattributed. My client relationships were being transferred to someone else. My access to company systems and information was being restricted while Michael's authority was being expanded. Most significantly, my concerns about these changes were being characterized as unprofessional resistance to collaboration, rather than legitimate questions about appropriate recognition and attribution. The psychological impact had been as significant as the professional implications. For months I'd been operating under the assumption that my contributions were valued and that my role within the company was secure and expanding. The Morrison Group meeting had forced me to confront the possibility that I'd been systematically deceived about my professional standing, and that my future with Chen Digital was far more precarious than I'd understood. That evening, I'd spent hours reviewing my employment agreement, client contracts, and company policies, searching for language that might protect my work product or guarantee appropriate attribution for my contributions. What I'd discovered had been both disappointing and illuminating. My employment agreement included standard intellectual property clauses that assigned ownership of my work to the company, but it contained no provisions requiring attribution or preventing reassignment of my responsibilities to other employees. The realization that I had no legal protection against the appropriation of my work had been devastating, but it had also been liberating in an unexpected way. If the company could reassign my contributions and relationships without restriction, then I had no obligation to remain in a situation where my professional value was being systematically transferred to someone else. The Morrison Group meeting had been my first clear warning that my position was becoming untenable, but it had also been the moment when I'd begun to consider alternatives that didn't depend on other people's recognition of my worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.